Isabelle Taft, welcome to the show. You are immigration reporter for New York Focus. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
When I saw that New York Focus hired a immigration reporter or started immigration reporting, I was really happy about because it was really, I think, it's an important time in the Latino community, especially what's going on with ICE and immigration now in the country. I just want to know what things are you covering for New York Focus as an immigration reporter?
Yeah, New York Focus is a nonprofit publication really focused on holding New York state and local actors accountable. And so, what I really tried to do in this moment where there's so much federal flux in immigration policies that's having really dramatic effects on people's lives, I'm really trying to understand how are New York State agencies, elected officials responding? How are local officials and across the state responding? How are they interacting with, in some cases, actively supporting federal immigration authorities in this crackdown, this mass deportation campaign? And so, to be a little more specific, a big theme so far has been looking at how local law enforcement is working with immigration authorities. In particular, I worked with my colleague Julia Rock on how local sheriff's departments are working with ICE to hold ICE detainees in their jails, getting paid by the federal government to provide bed space to hold people who are not accused of any crime, just New Yorkers facing deportation proceedings. Have also looked at the state's efforts to resettle immigrants who came to New York City in the 2022 to 2024 period, migrant crisis, trying to understand how those efforts worked, didn't work. In many cases, people who came to the city and the state during that period are now being arrested, detained by ICE, and raises questions about how the state has protected or not protected folks in that situation. And then also looking at elected officials and potential policy changes that they could make around things like dignity, not detention, which would prohibit local law enforcement from detaining people for ICE. So that would eliminate some of what we've seen with local jails. And then New York for All limiting law enforcement collaboration with immigration authorities, where especially parts of upstate New York, I'll hear anecdotes about someone getting pulled over by a sheriff's deputy or a police officer in their town, and then that officer calls ICE for customs and border protection. So that's a broad overview of what we've been looking at so far.
Let's talk about that we're talking during Hispanic Heritage Month. How do you see journalism playing a role in maybe amplifying Latino voices that might otherwise go unheard, especially those who are being detained and possibly deported?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the most important things that journalists should be doing in this moment, and that I've tried to do in this moment, just make contact with people who are being directly affected by these policies. And to your point, that involved reaching out to people who are detained on behalf of ICE in the Broome County Jail. So working with some jail advocates there who had kind of information about people on the inside, then using messaging platforms to communicate with them, get on the phone with them, just hear directly from them. What's your story? What's it like to be detained in this jail right now? What are you expecting for your future? How has this affected your life? And I think that is really important just to tell the full story, because otherwise it's just the people who run the jail telling us what they say is happening inside the jail and why they're doing this, and it's not the full story. Um, and also had spoken with a young man who has deportation protected from deportation, and New Yorker who was arrested in August and has been detained in Louisiana ever since, even though he has a form of legal status here. So I was able to speak with him from the detention center that he's in Louisiana. And so do feel like it's really important right now to make extra efforts to get in touch with people who are in these situations where, like, by design, they're being kept out of the public eye. And that's very much the intention of detaining them.
Now, what my experience with the Latino community in doing coverage here, and I say at least for the Sullivan Catskills, it's been very hard to get inside the community just because they're scared. I remember times when let's say during the pandemic when PPE wasn't given out to some of the farm workers or the factory workers that we have here, sort of in Catskills. And it a lot of times when we try to get interviews with someone from the Latino community who's directly affected by the policies, they were very hesitant to talk to us just because they're just scared of being deported or being found out or even just targeted, even if they have legal status here. Have you found that in your reporting?
Yeah, I've found that to some degree, and with the reporting that I have done in county jails, it's been unsurprisingly some people that I'll reach out to, maybe they wanna talk to me, but they absolutely don't want their name used because of that fear that you just described. But then for other people, one person that I talked to in the Broome County Jail said, "I don't think things can get any worse for me. I'm happy to have you publish my name because I want people to know what's happening to me, and I just hope that being public about this could do some good." So it's definitely been, in my experience so far, a mixed bag, and I just try to keep in mind, always make the ask, always respect and understand if people don't wanna talk or don't wanna talk with their name. And I should also add I'm very new to this role, and so don't have super comprehensive experience. And I'm sure if we had this conversation in 3 months or 6 months, I would have different examples, different answers.
Yeah. Let me ask, I should ask this in the beginning, but let me ask about your background. How did you make your way to New York Focus?
Yeah, I most recently was covering national news at the New York Times as a reporting fellow and did a little bit of reporting on immigration there, particularly the aftermath of a massive workplace raid in Mississippi in 2019 during the first Trump administration. And I had actually lived in Mississippi and been a reporter there for 4 years. And so the experience of covering national news and getting some experience covering immigration made me feel like wanted to continue covering this beat, but wanted to do it for a local audience because I just love local news and I love local accountability reporting and feel like there's so many stories that get missed if you're not approaching the work with a local mindset. And in Mississippi, a lot of the work that I did had to do with law enforcement intersecting with other kind of areas of life. So, in particular, health and mental health. And so, was interested in covering this beat in a state where it's tremendously important at huge immigrant communities, very much in conflict with the federal government, but then also a very politically, geographically, racially diverse state where in different parts of the state, the story of the Trump administration's immigration policies are going to look totally different. And I have some investigative reporting experience as well as news experience. So was excited to join a publication where there's an opportunity for a lot of different types of storytelling and stories.
Yeah. Has there, and since I know you're new and you have written a couple stories already, but has there been any story since you have your time there in New York Focus that sort of maybe shifted your perspective on immigration or maybe reconfirmed your immigration experience while reporting in the state?
Oh, that's a great question. I think one story that I found maybe clarifying just in terms of thinking about the recent history of immigration in New York State had to do with the Migrant Relocation Assistance Program, which was roughly $30 million effort launched in 2023 to help families leave New York City shelters for other parts of the state. And what I found in that reporting was that under the second Trump administration, I think close to 20 families that participated in that program with lots of support from the state have now been impacted by arrests, detentions, in some cases, deportations by ICE. And I think for me, that really drove home in a place like New York, whatever the state has tried to do to, however imperfectly, to welcome immigrants, to support them, to integrate them into the community, all of that is potentially being undermined by policies at the federal level. And I think it's an important question in New York to think about for a state that says it welcomes immigrants. What does it actually look like in this moment to oppose really harsh immigration policies? What can the state actually do? And so working on that story for me, I think solidified just like the importance of trying to ask that question and really dig into that because I think that's a piece of the national story that's very specific to the state that we all live in.
Yeah. Now, in your reporting, what have you learned about now, when we talk about immigrants, obviously, and immigrants come in all shapes and sizes, all cultural backgrounds. It's not just Latinos communities that are coming to this country. But right now, the focus in this, I feel I should say, is the focus of this administration is on the Latino community. What have you learned about yourself, about the Hispanic Latino community that sort of shapes New York's identity that's just beyond the population number, because obviously the Hispanic community is growing here. But what have you found in your reporting that sort of that shows them as human beings and they're actual people who have these lives and living here?
Yeah, I think one thing that just stands out to me is just the tremendous diversity in every single possible way when you're talking about New York's Latino community. And just in the course of my reporting, I've had the opportunity to meet folks who came here from Venezuela 2 or 3 years ago, have met folks who have been advocates for the Puerto Rican community in Rochester historically. So just thinking about the Hispanic community in New York, it's not all immigrants. The immigrant community in New York is certainly not all Hispanic, not all Latino. And I think the presidential election in 2024, which was before I was a reporter for New York Focus, but that really illustrated just the political diversity within this community, that there were plenty of Latino New Yorkers who voted for President Trump and plenty of people who immigrated to the US 20 years ago, 30 years ago, who did not see necessarily themselves in the way that people who arrived in 2022, 2023, 2024. So I think I've just been struck by the incredible richness of culture and individual experiences, and really trying to make sure that I'm not making assumptions about what is the Latino experience or the Hispanic experience in New York, because it's so clear from even just a couple months of reporting, there obviously is not one, there's hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, and because you always say is the Hispanic community, Latino community is not a monolith. It is so many different cultures within that community. So speaking on that, what do you think people often get wrong about the Latino community and how they are represented in mainstream media since your time there in New York Focus?
That's a good question. I don't know that I feel that I have a good answer to that from my vantage point. I think, yeah, just would want to spend more time learning about reality and also reading mainstream coverage with an eye toward that question. I do think it stood out to me in 2024 that it seemed like there was a belief, especially among maybe Democratic politicians, that Latino voters were going to reject Trump because of his stance on immigration. And the reality is, like many Americans, many Latino voters were interested in what he had to say on affordability, on cost of living, and also don't really see themselves as the same as the people that Trump is saying he wants to deport. So I think that maybe reflects some misconception that people are much more than their ethnic identity, and they're not making voting decisions based on that, which is true of everybody.
That's something I've also found surprising during the election was that the Latinos for Trump. It was surprising at the same time it wasn't, because growing up in a Latino community, I know that a lot of the older Hispanic and Latino folks were more conservative
Yeah.
eats. So you see that sort of the sort of that dynamic happening. As your time evolves there at New York Focus, how do you think immigration reporting will evolve over the years? And what role do you want to play in that sort of involvement and as it plays out?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm so new to it and I don't have a crystal ball. I'm a little hesitant to make predictions, but yeah, I really hope that our work helps people understand how local and state actors here in New York kind of shape the experiences of immigrants in New York, but really how that in turn shapes everyone's lives here. That sounds really vague, but I think there's a lot of room to dig into just policies and politics that have anything to do with immigration. So one example is immigration services fraud. There's a huge amount of fraud targeting people who are facing deportation or have uncertain legal status in this country, and it's what could the state be doing to address that? What is the state doing when it gets complaints about those kinds of things? Is there adequate staffing to investigate those complaints. So just not speaking about immigration reporting in general, but for us here in New York Focus, I think the priority is going to continue to be understanding how our state and local governments are doing their jobs.
Yeah. So Isabel, before we go, is there anything else that we have not touched on you want folks to know about your reporting or any sort of upcoming stories that you are working on?
I would just say I welcome at this point all kinds of tips, ideas, observations, thoughts. We're going to keep covering local law enforcement and immigration collaboration really closely, but really interested to hear from listeners statewide about what, you're seeing in your communities that we should be digging into. Would love to hear from you anytime.
Absolutely. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We're talking to Isabelle Taft, immigration reporter for New York Focus. Again, thank you so much for joining us on the program and letting us know about your reporting.
Yeah, thank you, Patricio. Thanks for having me.